Hello and welcome to another video lecture for Classics and Ancient Mediterranean Studies 1103, Classical Mythology. I'm Roger Travis, and I don't even know if anyone can do this, but if you can identify the place in the picture behind me, you get some sort of a little prize. Do it in the contest forum on Husky CT. Enjoy the lecture.
So now we get to talk about the myths that you probably thought were going to be our main subject when you decided to take a course in classical mythology. This is the material to be found in chapters 3, 4, and 5 of your classical mythology book edited by Morford and Lenardon. What I'm going to try to get you to see, however, is that now that we know about double determination and its role in the Odyssey, we're going to be able to look at this material, the creation myths, the succession myths, the Titans and the gods, the Olympians, in a new light. What I'm going to suggest is that all of this stuff that we find in chapters 3, 4, and 5 of the classical mythology textbook actually is best seen as what I'm going to call backstory for the Homeric epics and the other epics of the epic tradition that we've lost. One of the things we know about the development of Greek mythology is that the works of the Iliad and the Odyssey, the works of the Homeric tradition, came earlier than the works that we're looking at now in chapters 3, 4, and 5. That is, let's call them the creation myths and the succession myths. This seems a little odd to us because we're used to traditions of sacred story where creation comes at the beginning. And what I want to suggest is that that actually comes from our knowledge of books like the Hebrew Bible, where the creation story is at the beginning. But what's very interesting when you look at the development of the Greek mythological tradition, and I don't think that this is actually dissimilar from the way that the Hebrew Bible evolved, is that the heroic stories come first. That is, the stories of heroes like Odysseus and Agamemnon and Achilles are the stories that come together first out of the mythic tradition. And it's later that the stories of the gods evolve. Those are the stories that are found most importantly in Hesiod's Theogony, which is the work from which most of the material in Morford and Lenardon chapters 3, 4, and 5 come from. The reason that creation myth comes into being then is in order to explain these figures that we find in the Iliad and the Odyssey, that is, the figures of the gods. Now, those figures of the gods had existed in cult before they began to make their entrance into the Homeric tradition. But once the bards of the Homeric tradition, for example, the bards of the Odyssey, have this neat idea that they're going to add this grandeur by the mechanism that I've been calling double determination, that the gods are going to come in and provide an extra boost for the heroes. Then there's the impetus for a new kind of myth, and that is the creation myth, the succession myth, the myths of the 12 Olympians, as we have them recorded above all in Hesiod's Theogony. There's a wonderful way to illustrate this, which at the same time will introduce you to one of the most important kinds of myth we're going to be encountering in the course, and that is, I'm going to show you that Hesiod's Theogony, the work that gives us our most important stories about creation and succession, is in fact in origin the same kind of story as the Homeric hymns that we're going to be seeing throughout the course as one of our most important sources of stories about the gods. If you look at page 55 of your Morford and Lenardon classical mythology book, you'll notice that when they begin to quote the Theogony, they begin at line 22. What they don't tell you is the way that the Hesiodic Theogony begins, and so I'm going to go back to the very beginning of the Theogony and read you from line 1. From the Heliconian muses let us begin to sing, who hold the great and holy mount of Helicon, and dance on soft feet about the deep blue spring and the altar of the almighty son of Kronos, that's Zeus. And when they have washed their tender bodies in Permessus or in the horse's spring or Olmeus, make their fair lovely dances upon highest Helicon, and move with vigorous feet. And it goes on like that, describing the muses, and it's only then later that it gets to the part that you'll find on page 55 of Classical Mythology, the textbook. Why does this matter? Well, it matters because it tells us something very important about where the theogony came from. And so in order to figure out what that is, I need to move us around the textbook and take some other examples that have very similar beginnings. As we go through the Morford and Lenardon textbook, we're going to find a lot of these things that are called Homeric hymns. A few of them are quite long, and they tell wonderful stories, like the hymn to Aphrodite and the hymn to Hermes. But there are many, many more of them that are quite short, and a very good example is the one on page 159. Here is this Homeric hymn to Poseidon. About Poseidon, a great god, I begin to sing, the shaker of the earth and of the barren sea, ruler of the deep, and also over Mount Helicon and the broad town of Aigai. A double honor the gods have allotted to you, O earth shaker, to be both a tamer of horses and a savior of ships. Hail, dark-haired Poseidon, who surrounds the earth, and, O blessed god, be of kind heart and protect those who sail your waters. This is the most basic kind of Homeric hymn, and you'll see this type of Homeric hymn over and over and over again. It begins with an invocation of the god, and it ends very often with a farewell to the god, like Hail, dark-haired Poseidon, and then very frequently it also says, and I will remember you in another song too. If you look for a moment at page 182, for example, you'll find at the end of this short hymn to Aphrodite, Hail, sweet and winning goddess, with your seductive glance, grant that I may win victory in the contest and make my song fitting. Yet I shall remember you and another song too. What we can tell about these hymns, which often begin with, let us begin to sing from the Heliconian muses, let us begin to sing from Poseidon, and end with, I will remember you in another song too, is that these hymns were originally short preludes to heroic epic. It was only later that the bards seized on the idea of these short preludes as a way of making a new kind of mythological poetry. They realized that by taking the form of these preludes and blowing it up, making it larger, they could tell a new kind of wonderful, interesting story about the gods. And that's how the Hesiodic Theogony began. It began as a hymn to the muses, and it was only as it developed, as the bards sang it over and over again, that it became a huge story of creation myth. And what created the demand for this creation myth? Well, the only thing that could have created the demand was the use of double determination in Homeric epic. These are the epics, the individual books of the Odyssey and the Iliad as they were originally sung, that had in them the gods as narrative figures. These gods who had just been cult figures before, who had received worship in the everyday lives of the audiences of the original epics, well, now they wanted to know, that is, the audience wanted to know what these gods were like, what their backstory was. And so, in that way, a market, if you will, for a new kind of mythic poetry came into being, and that market was satisfied by the longer Homeric hymns that we're going to read as the course goes on, and by, perhaps more than anything else, the Hesiodic Theogony. And so this is probably also the best moment to talk about who Hesiod and Homer were. And it's the time to tell you that our best evidence indicates that both Hesiod and Homer were traditions and not individual people, although later Greeks remembered them as having been individual people, remembered them even as having been writers. And we know for a fact that they can't have been writers because our comparative evidence, the evidence we've been studying since the 1940s, tells us pretty conclusively that the way that the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Theogony and the Works and Days came together was in the form of oral improvisatory recomposition. That is, recomposition where the bards, these singers of tales, would sing a different version of their songs every night in order to entertain their audiences in a culture that was, as I've said before, completely oral. We can also tell that there was a kind of rivalry between the tradition in Asia Minor, the Homeric tradition, and the tradition in Boeotian Thebes, that is the Hesiodic tradition. Now, our best guess as to the meanings of these names, Homer and Hesiod, is that Homeros means the guy who puts the song together, and Hesiodos means the guy who sends forth his voice. Both of these could very easily be titles for bards. And so the impression that we get in the end is of two traditions evolving in the latter part of their history, side by side. The Homeric tradition seems to be earlier, the Hesiodic tradition seems to be later, and it therefore makes sense that the Homeric hymns and the Theogony would have developed as a kind of adjunct, as a kind of backstory for the Homeric epics, above all the Iliad and the Odyssey.